Hi, everybody. Today we have got a big but really interesting topic, which is going to be Expressionism. Now, the term expressionism, I have to say, is a little bit vague, and it's a term that's really used quite a bit to describe any art that followed the period of Impressionism. It was used to talk about artists like Gauguin and Matisse and Cézanne and Van Gogh and the Fauves. It really became just sort of a generic term to talk about modern art, particularly modern art whose focus was on subjective human experience rather than looking and describing the world you see around you, like we saw as the purpose of realism and impressionism. So in other words, it was not really a uniform style, and the term is used in a wide variety of ways. So we're going to get very specific, though, and talk about German Expressionism, which is a much more specific style and a more defined group of artists who really have their heyday between 1910 and 1920, although they last as far as the 1930s until ultimately a lot of the German Expressionists were extinguished, at least their art was, by the Nazis. Now, for early German Expressionism, meaning German Expressionism before World War I, there are actually two artists that we can put into organized formal collaborations. One group which was known as Die Brücke and another which was known as Blaue Reiter. So these were artists who collectively exhibited their work and who in some cases had formal treatises and publications that they worked on together, and they worked in the same studios, even though the artists who are involved in the movement, who we're going to be looking at, as you can see just by looking at this, are vastly different. Yet we can come up with some general ideas of what Expressionism and German Expressionism is. First of all, as I said, it's going to be art with a focus on emotional content. They are, as you can see from looking here, artists who also have similarities in terms of other art movements, particularly Fauvism, because you could see here that same very bright, vibrant palette. You can see the same interest in flattening three-dimensional space and in a really sort of aggressive, impasto-like handling of the medium. And finally, like other periods we've been looking at, these are artists who were very aware of their historical moment. First of all, the German Expressionists were very interested in a lot of artists that we've studied from the prior 2 decades. Artists like Van Gogh and Munch and Klimt and Ensor. As you could see, they come to mind. But they were also artists who looked back to the more distant past with interests going all the way back towards the Middle Ages. And we'll look at specific examples of that. And like we saw with the Cubists, for example, or with the Fauves, these were artists that were interested in oceanic and African art as well. So first we're going to look at these two different groups of early German Expressionism, beginning with Der Brücke, and then we'll look at German Expressionism after the war, and then some other groups with some Austrian artists as well. Now, as I said, many German Expressionist artists continued to work into this style into the 1930s. But Hitler was not a fan of modern art, and though the Nazis tolerated some Expressionist painters, ultimately they demonized it as being an adversary to the people. In 1937, the museums were purged, and all of the work of these Expressionist artists were removed. So there were about 16,000 works that were confiscated by the Ministry of Propaganda. 5,000 works in 1939 were actually burned because they were said to have had no value. So some of these works were destroyed, others were sold abroad to raise money. And still others were publicly exhibited at a degenerate art show, meant sort of for public ridicule in 1937. So that really becomes the end of the German Expressionist period, because by that time, some of the German Expressionists fled Germany, others could no longer work in that style, and still others of these artists were imprisoned. Now, the first of these two early German Expressionist group that's sort of formally composed that we're going to talk about is a group that went by the name of the Künstlergruppe Brücke, or Die Brücke, which means the bridge. They formed in Dresden, the German city of Dresden, in 1906, and they were centered around a group of young architectural students, particularly Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. And originally, these group of young artists began to hang out in Kirchner's student residence. And interestingly, Kirchner was the only of the group who was formally trained as an artist in any way. And then ultimately they began to meet in Kirchner's studio, which the idea was that they modeled the studio space with this sort of idea of community spirit, like it was a medieval workshop. It was a place for social activity, for creativity. It was a very liberated environment, often associated with nudity. It was a young movement. And interestingly, out of all of the artists involved in Die Brücke, Kirchner is the one we're going to focus on the most, but we're then also going to talk about Emil Nolde, who is notably a bit older than the others. He was actually invited to join Die Brücke sometime between 1906 and 1907. So even though he was a little bit of an outsider for the group, he becomes one of its sort of most notable contributors. So overall, the idea of Die Brücke has a lot in common with other artistic movements we've seen. They wanted to overthrow the convention of academic training that they disagreed with and replace it with something that expressed the sort of modern German life. They were interested in the art of the past, and the artists of Die Brücke were interested in artists that we talked about recently, like Cézanne and Seurat and Gauguin and Van Gogh, the post-impressionists, as well as artists like Munch and Matisse. But they were also influenced in the art of the more distant past. But unlike a lot of artists who look back on the past and look towards the Italian Renaissance, which was really heralded as sort of a high point of artistic achievement, these were artists who were interested in sort of revitalizing a real German art. So they look towards Renaissance German art as their influences, and we'll look at some examples of that. So these were artists who were very interested in this sort of nationalistic German heritage. For that reason, they were also particularly interested in the medium of woodcut, which had a very long history in German art. You can actually see here an image that shows Die Brücke's sort of logo, and here it is made out of a woodcut. They took their title from the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote about many things, but he wrote against the idea of universal truth, saying that all of universal truth is truth for fiction, including the idea of God. So Nietzsche's famous statement of God is dead is something that resonated with these artists in this very modern world. These were, again, it was a youthful movement, which is something they emphasized in their own manifesto, which they published as part of a catalog for their first group exhibition in 1906. They wrote, "With a belief in progress and in a new generation of creators and supporters, we summon all youth together. As youth, we carry the future and want to create for ourselves freedom of life and movement in opposition to the well-established older forces. Everybody belongs to our cause who reproduces directly and passionately whatever urges him to create." So what we're going to do is we're going to look particularly, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at Kirchner, and then we'll look at Nolde. It was a short-lived movement. They ended up starting off in Dresden. They eventually moved to the more industrial metropolis of Berlin in 1911, but there was a lot of infighting and the group split for good in 1913. Now, we'll begin by looking at Kirchner, and we'll look at his career a little bit chronologically. From the time he became the sort of self-appointed leader of Die Brücke, at least until we get him towards World War I, which is a sort of formative experience for him. He is both a painter and a sculptor. He made wood sculptures, which is very interesting because, like woodcut, wood sculpture has a long tradition back in medieval Germany. So that fits with the themes that we were talking about. Um, by the way, Die Brücke has their very first exhibition in 1906, which was held in a former lampshade factory. And this work was begun not that long after that. Now, I just wanted to give you some sense of him as a character. There is a great description of him by a friend named Fritz Blale, who writes, I encountered a well-built, upright youth of the greatest self-assertion and the most passionate temper, who possessed a gloriously untroubled disposition and an infectiously candid laugh, and who was possessed by a sheer mania to draw, to paint, to busy himself, and to come to terms with artistic things and ideas. His digs were those of an avowed bohemian, full of pictures, drawings, books, paintings, and drawing gear, colorfully lying around everywhere. Much more the romantic lodgings of a painter than the dwellings of an orderly student of architecture. Now, this picture, which is called Street Dresden, is set in the fashionable area of Dresden called Königstrasse. And it was really Kirchner's first large-scale, ambitious sort of figure painting. You can see Kirchner's relationship to the artists of the recent past. For example, the Impressionists were interested in scenes of city life and street life, mostly because it offered them this sort of vibrant, joyous visual experience. Although at first glance you could see that Kirchner's impression of the modern city was a little bit different. You get the sense that he's not sort of singing the praises of the modern city. Instead, it is a picture that shows tension, it gives you a sense of claustrophobia, and a sense of anxiety that came along with the idea of the city. Now, you can see relationship to other artistic movements as well. More recently, the Fauves, because of, again, this very bright color palette. Although you get a sense here that he's using these colors, again, for a different purpose, which is to express anxiety through these clashing colors, which make us a little bit uncomfortable. Honestly, one of the greatest inspirations for a work like this would look like Edvard Munch. Munch, especially if you think of the Scream, you can see similarities both in the curvilinear forms, which are repeated throughout, in the bright clashing of colors, the very rough brushstroke, and also in the sort of jarring perspective that makes us feel a little bit uneasy, this sort of forced perspective. Here you could see the lines of the pavement moving back to a streetcar that blocks our view in the back. So you get this sense of, dissonance and in this frenzied urban activity, even though some of the figures seem quite frozen. The picture is almost all populated by female figures, except along the left-hand side, where we see one male looking sort of menacingly out towards the viewer who's cut by the frame. And that's a device we've also seen artists like Degas take a lot of interest in. But despite this bustle of figures, we have these three frontal women who look out at us, all wearing these tremendous oversized hats. Most sort of shocking is the young girl that we see in the middle distance. Like we've seen in other artists of the time, there is this wonderful tension between 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions. So yes, there's this sense of thrusting perspective, which is very steep, like we saw it in Munch's The Scream. But we can also see the artist playing with 2-dimensional pattern, and we noticed it most specifically here in the treatment of the ground. So you can see that the ground plane sort of swirls up into the picture, and it creates its own forms that are echoed in the swirling forms of the figures. And we notice that most particularly in this sort of halo that forms in this pink ground plane around the girl with her hat. So that is something that looks very much like a two-dimensional shape, this sort of wonderful pattern of movement rather than something that is truly three-dimensional. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of these artists as urban artists. Another picture that dates a little bit later gives us more ideas about how Kirchner was working as an artist, and particularly how his studio worked. The picture is called Franzi in front of a carved chair. And this is a girl who, along with another girl whose name was Marcella, started hanging out at Kirchner's studio with Die Brücke artists from the time probably that she was around 8 years old, but there's definitely many images of her from around these years, 1910, when she was 10 years old, all the way until she was about 15 years old. She posed for these artists nude and posed for them for a lot of their pictures. So Franzi and Marcella became sort of just types that the artist could use as models. And from 1905 on, all of these artists were particularly interested in the subject of the nude. By the way, Kirchner was also a photographer. And so we have these wonderful photographs of his studio and what it looked like. And this is actually a photograph he takes of Franzi, whose real name was Lena Franziska Fehrmann. There's a photograph he takes of her in this same year in 1910. Listen, you can read up on it. We don't know that much about the relationship between Franzi and the other artists or with Kirchner, and whether or not, I know it's been speculated now that Kirchner is a pedophile because of this. There are very opaque writings about Kirchner who suggested that she might have had a sexual relationship with one of the other artists in the workshop. But we know that Kirchner stays in touch with her. She ended up having 2 children out of wedlock. She was from a poorer family. She was the 12th child of a butcher. And she ends up having a child when she was 16. But Kirchner goes to visit her in Dresden in 1926. So he did maintain a friendship with this young girl who was one of Die Brücke's muses. It's a wonderful picture to talk about the relationship of the German Expressionists with other art movements of its time. And most notable of this would be to think about the influence of Matisse, who we saw as the primary fauve painter. And though I didn't show you, this is one of Matisse's most famous pictures, which is called The Green Stripe. It's usually what it's referred to as, or as the Green Line. It's actually a portrait of Matisse's wife, much like the woman with the hat that we saw that he exhibited in the autumn exhibition in the early part of the 20th century. So very similarly, we have Kirchner playing with these even more arbitrary colors. In this work, very sort of artificial acid tones. The picture by Kirchner is also quite interesting, though. I mean, it's painted very similarly, rough brush strokes, flattened shapes, and then these bright patches of unnatural color. But you can also see in this the interest in Kirchner in African art as well. You'll notice that Franzi's sitting on this carved chair, and it was actually a chair that Kirchner had carved based on his interest in African art. In 1910, in Dresden, the Ethnographic Museum reopened, and so you see this re-emerged interest in African and oceanic art. And this was apparently a chair that he had carved based on some art from Cameroon that he was interested in. And so Kirchner carves this chair out of wooden planks and paints it, you could see this sort of flesh tone and black. And so we have these sort of two faces that we see juxtaposed together, both very artificial, both mask-like. And then what's interesting about it is he's playing with the idea of nature and artifice. So she's the real flesh, but she's painted with this sort of green mask, whereas the chair, which is really based on African masks and is a construction, is painted with these flesh tones. And so you could see the tension between what is real and what is not. There's also then maybe some sort of connotation that's being made by Kirchner to juxtapose the young girl and sort of innocence with the so-called primitive carving. Now, since we've been talking about Kirchner's references in the art of the past, a really interesting picture to look at just briefly is his 1910 painting Nude with a Hat, which is a nearly life-size vertical study of a woman named Doris Grosse, who was Kirchner's girlfriend from about 1906 until at least 1911. And here he's painting her nude, and she's standing before a curtain behind her, a patterned curtain that's pulled aside, behind which we see a sofa and some erotic, in some cases, sort of primitivist art. Kirchner actually wrote about this picture in 1919 in his journal, and what he said is this. He said, "You, Dodo," which is her nickname, "you, Dodo, with your diligent hands, still and fine, and so palely beautiful, your fine free lust for love, with you I experience it to the full, almost at the risk of my destiny. Yet you give me the power of speaking about your beauty, the purest image of a woman, compared with which Cranach's Venus is an old crone." Now, the reference to Cranach's Venus has to do with a German Renaissance painter of the 16th painter named Lucas Cranach the Elder. And he was sort of famous for painting these thinly disguised nude portraits of contemporary women, but he called them Venuses, which was a way back in the Renaissance for you to allow to have nude portraits of contemporary women. You just called them Venus, and then all of a sudden they were acceptable. It is the portrait of probably 1932 that he's purposefully referencing here, the one that you see on the left-hand side, with that very, very direct gaze. But I also brought in the portrait from 1529, just because it shows that hat and the tilt of the head. So you could see he's sort of compositing these pictures. Both of them share this idea of showing sort of a nude, at least the one on the right, in a contemporary kind of clothing that emphasizes the fact that they're naked, which we see very much in the portrait of Dodo. Kirchner loved the portrait. He called it his best nude from Dresden. So this is an important work for this period. We can see all of the same stylistic things we've seen before. The flat, bright coloring that we saw with Matisse and with the Fauves. But again, here with him very specifically looking back on the art of the German past. Now, Kirchner moved from Dresden to Berlin in October of 1911, mostly to more closely align himself with the Neue Succession group, which we're going to talk about. But even when he moved to Berlin, he continued to approach the subject of the city street as one that really interested him, and he did 11 paintings of Berlin street scenes. Now, Berlin, just like when we talked about Monet and the growth of the city of Paris, Berlin was rapidly expanding in size. So in 1800, Berlin had maybe 170,000 residents. But by 1900, just one century later, the population was like 2 million. There were motorized trams, there were horse-drawn omnibuses, there were electric streetcars. So this is the bustling city that Kirchner becomes really interested in. Now, as we saw with the last two works of art, Kirchner is also drawing models with whom he is intimately familiar. Now, by the time he moves to Berlin, his models here are a woman named Erna Schilling and his sister, whose name was Gerda. Erna here is shown as the woman in the blue, dress that we see here with the red hat, and her sister Gerda is the woman in the red. Erna actually would be Kirchner's companion for the rest of his life. Now, originally he had a short relationship probably with Gerda, but she died from syphilis in 1923. So the picture is based upon these two models, but he presents it as a street scene. So we see two men sort of in the foreground, one facing into the picture, one with a cigarette facing out of the picture. We see two women, the one in the red and the blue, who are Erna and Gerda. And we even see two horses in the back, which are sort of pulling away. And you could see the number 15 over here in the background, which is painted on an omnibus. So this shows us sort of the hustle and bustle of the city, which is a subject we had already seen him exploring while he was in Dresden. So here his style has changed a little bit. It's more angular. There's a greater sense of sort of nervousness to the treatment of the surface with these slashes of paint that show more emotional power. Now the women themselves are an interesting issue. We saw these women before in the Dresden street scene with these sort of large hats on them. But in the case of this picture, it's possible that the women are supposed to represent prostitutes. Now, bordellos and brothels, they were outlawed, and you weren't allowed to openly solicit people on the street as a prostitute. But prostitutes were known to have worn the latest fashions, and they would go unescorted in public places, and they sort of relied upon these quick glances with their male counterparts as they tried to solicit business. So it's possible that when we see these two women in the midground and the two horses in the background, it's this idea that they're all sort of members of the trade. Now, it's possible that the man we see here with the cigarette is Kirchner himself. If you follow down his arm, you see this awkwardly positioned hand bent backwards. And it falls, it's the only hand visible really in the work as prominent, and it falls right over his signature, which means that might be sort of an autographical kind of nod. Now, interestingly, Kirchner talked about this work, and he wrote about it in a letter of 1937, and he said, "It would be interesting for once to see this particular piece next to one by Dürer. I really think it would hold its own and would show the differences and even more, the similarities as well." So what he was referring to here, we've talked about the idea that Kirchner was interested in relating himself to the German art of the past. That's why he was purposefully referencing Cranach, for example. Dürer is really the preeminent German Renaissance artist, one who was skilled in engraving and woodcut and painting. And here we're specifically looking at an engraving of the four witches, which show these four nude standing, and it's got a very, very similar arrangement to Kirchner's Berlin street scene, where, as we saw in the Dresden street scene, figures are standing in close proximity, but there's not really any interaction between the figures. In any case, by the time Kirchner painted this, Die Brücke had already fallen apart, and he was facing his own challenges as he tried to make his way, inside the Berlin art world. Now, when 1914 came, Kirchner actually volunteered for service in the war, mostly because he wanted to be a driver in the artillery so he could avoid serving in the infantry. And he served for a year until 1915, until he had a nervous breakdown and he was dismissed from military service, which led to a period of him drinking and him becoming addicted to morphine. So this is a self-portrait that Kirchner does, and he does quite a few self-portraits. But here we see one of him, a sort of fictive self-portrait of him as a soldier. Now, some parts are not fictive. We can actually see the uniform he shows himself in. It's the uniform of the 75th Artillery Regiment, which is accurately depicted along with the symbols on his cap, which represent Prussia and the German Reich. Now, what kind of portrait this is interesting. There's a sense of agitation here. He has eyes that appear that they're sort of sightless. He looks very gaunt, and he even shows himself fictively with an amputated right hand, which looks like it's also sort of suffering with gangrene. This might be a statement about his mental health at the time or his sort of alienation, but it does show the way that he is still attached to his art. Behind him, we can see two panel paintings and a nude model, and he is shown completely integrated with them. So we could see the way that that slender sort of face of his wedges perfectly between the canvas on one side and the model's arm on the other. And again, that's that assertion of the two-dimensional plane rather than the three-dimensional. And we could see the way, for example, the shape of his collar, which is lined with red trim, matches the shape of the model's body beside him and her groin. So this is all very purposeful, and it shows the state he's in by 1915 when he was forced to leave the service. Kirchner's mental state would not entirely improve, and in fact in 1938, after his work was branded as degenerate by the Nazis, Kirchner committed suicide. Now, the next artist I want to talk to is a little bit different, which is an artist called Emil Nolde, who was the oldest of these German expressionists and had a very different background. He grew up on a farm and he was essentially self-taught as a painter. He, by the way, is going to share this admiration for sort of the quote-unquote primitive cultures, and he's going to travel to the South Seas. He went to China and Japan on his way to New Guinea with a government-sponsored expedition. He was actually invited to join Die Brücke, even though he was a bit older than the other artists, by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, who was one of the painters involved in the movement. And he wrote a letter to Nolde in February of 1906, and he said, "To come straight to the point, this artist group known as Brücke would consider it a great privilege to welcome you as a member. Naturally, you probably know as little about the Brücke as we did about you prior to your exhibition at Arnold's. Now one of our aims is to unite all the revolutionary and radical elements. That is what the Brücke stands for. The group also arranges several exhibitions that tour Germany every year. Another aim, only a dream right now, as there is no money, is to get our own exhibition space. Now, dear Herr Nolde, you can think what you like. We only wanted to let you know how much we admire your violent color storms." To that, Nolde replied, "I was not alone. There were other young painters imbued with the future, with aims similar to my own." Now, he didn't last very long in the group, and he withdrew from it pretty quickly by 1907. So he only lasted about a year and a half. He thought that the group was too interested and dependent on Van Gogh's exceptionally emotional style. And Nolde said, "The quicker a painting is done, the better it is." So let's talk a little bit about what Nolde was interested in. He was religious, and he was interested in sort of this primitive religiosity that sort of brought art close to magic. He was very interested in the aesthetics of the Middle Ages, including stained glass. He was interested actually in a lot of the traditional genres of painting, things that were old-fashioned in a way, like still life, flower pieces, landscapes, and religious compositions, which we're going to look at quite a few of. In terms of his own background, Nolde has become a controversial figure because he was a charter member of the Nazi Party. So he, like we talked with Kirchner, was very interested in this nationalistic idea of German art, but he went further and he looked at Cubism and other artistic movements like constructivism as being Jewish, and because of that, he disliked them. Now, he also, by the way, because he's so interested in traditional subjects, shuns the more urban subjects that we saw Kirchner involved in, like the city street and things like that. Ultimately, even though he was so interested in the German character of art and the Germanness of it, he ultimately found himself shunned by the Nazi Party. And in fact, his work was labeled degenerate by the Nazis because it was incompatible with the taste of the Nazis, which tended towards a sort of neoclassical kind of art. So his works were confiscated by the German state, and they were shown in that major degenerate art exhibition in the late 1930s, which were meant to sort of denigrate and ridicule the avant-garde. This work is one of Nolde's series of religious pictures. Now, he began an intense series of works on religious subjects between 1909 and 1912. So this is right at the beginning of that. But really, he did about 50 religious paintings before his death in 1956. So this was really just at the start of this, and it shows him moving away from what had been very early on in his career, a little bit more of an impressionistic kind of style. And he becomes more and more interested in the interior of things, the inner value of things rather than optical stimuli. So he was himself very religious. It said that he read the Bible often and that he was a practicing Lutheran. Nolde actually gives a sort of autobiographical story about the painting of this picture, and it said that he was recovering from a very bad illness. And he talked about the sort of religious overtones in the work. He said the illness, by the way, was from drinking tainted water. And he wrote this: "Without much intention, knowledge, or thought, I had followed an irresistible urge to represent profound spirituality, religion, and fervor. A few of the heads of the apostles and a head of Christ I had sketched before. Near shock I stood before the drawing. No image of nature was near me, and now I was to paint the most mysterious, the most profound, most inward event of all Christian religion. Christ, his face transfigured, sanctified and withdrawn, on both sides and before him the circle of his disciples deeply moved. I painted and I painted, hardly knowing whether it was day or night, whether I was a human being or only a painter. I saw the painting when I went to bed. It confronted me during the night. It faced me when I woke up. I painted happily. The painting was finished. The Last Supper." So this was a sort of monumental moment for him. And you could see that he writes from this really religious place, and he paints from that same place. In fact, Nolde said that it was, quote unquote, simple people who responded to his works instinctively. He had gone to Paris right around 1900, and he studied the works in the Louvre, he looked at the works of the ancient masters, and he wasn't that impressed. He referred to the half-depraved sophisticates in the superficial glitter of the city. So he arranges this picture in a very different way, and it's actually, like we saw with Kirchner, arranged to reference the art of the past. There is a type in 16th century German and Northern European art which has a very similar format, where we see half-length figures compressed up against the picture plane. And here you could see this is a work again from Lucas Cranach the Elder. So we saw Kirchner looking at Cranach, and you see Nolde looking at Cranach too, where so you can see in both of the works the figures are cut off. There's an empty space in the front of the work, which is intended to allow the viewer to become part of the picture. But we can also see some differences, obviously, in Nolday's work. He's interested in very flattened forms compared to Cranach, in this very active surface, and you can see this sort of very rough treatment, this impastoed application of the paint, which gives you this really visceral reaction. And very broad areas of color, which were also inspired by Matisse, but of course with a very different feeling. And the whole idea is it was supposed to give us a sense of the inner spirituality of these figures. Now, honestly, people did not react very well to these, and they were harshly criticized, his religious paintings, when they were first seen, and that left Nolde somewhat hurt and resentful. Now, Nolde, like Kirchner, was also a printmaker, especially, as I said, woodblock prints, because that had this long German tradition. And it would have been particularly well suited for an artist like Nolde, who was interested in religious subjects. You see, even if you go back to Renaissance German artists, woodcut was the favored medium for sort of mystical subjects. You see, when you work in a print medium, woodcut is what we call a relief technique, meaning you start with a block of wood, you carve away any areas that you don't want to appear in the print. So you carve away the white areas so that when you roll ink across the top of the block and press it onto paper, you get anything you've left on the surface of the block creates an impression. So that's where you get all the black marks on the block. Now, this kind of printmaking lends itself to very bold graphic styles. I mean, you can't make very slender pieces of wood standing off the block with a lot of detail because it would actually break. So it takes other media of printmaking, more notably engraving, to create more subtle techniques. Engraving is what we call an intaglio technique, where you start with a surface like a copper plate, and instead of excavating anywhere you don't want there to be color and leaving the surface where you want black to be, you do the opposite. You gouge lines into the surface of the copper plate where you want the ink to be. Because of that, you can create much finer lines and smaller effects. So engraving often gets used for subjects that were more intellectual and contemplative, but these sort of very spiritual subjects really worked well with the medium of woodcut. Woodcut is binary. You either get black or you get white. And so here you can see this very bold graphic effect of Nolde's most famous woodcut, which is simply called Prophet. Kind of like what we saw with Kirchner. We see this very sort of angular, sort of starved face. It appears mask-like we saw just in Nolde's Last Supper, but it's also sort of emaciated as a way of showing spirituality. And again, all harshly represented in black and white. You can see the way that Nolde is looking back on earlier artists like Munch, who also worked in prints, and artists like Ensor, who were interested in, again, this sort of mask-like quality. And this was another work like The Last Supper that Nolde created after he had sort of a religious transformation while he was recovering from his illness that we spoke of. So here he's really exploiting the medium of woodcut with these exaggerated lines, with these deep gougings, and he's leaving the lines of the print really, really rough, so you can see the sort of wood quality of the print. So Nolde really takes advantage of the medium in order to express meaning. Now, around 1911, Nolde begins to use the motif of the mask in his art. And in fact, in that year, he starts having a relationship with James Ensor, who we've already seen. And so we saw that Ensor was using masks as a way to suggest human cruelty and suffering. And so Nolde seems to hook on to this same idea. He was interested, though, in the art of indigenous people. So we know that he was going to the ethnological museums, and he became interested in the sort of abstract, rhythmic sense of color and pattern and ornament in his art. And he also saw this as relating to his own notions of what we might call anti-classicalism. Right? So he ended up, as we know, we went to New Guinea and he went to the South Pacific right around 1913. That's a little bit later, where he was a pictorial reporter for the German colonial ministry. And he wrote sort of admirably of the native population there. He said, a magnificent people, insofar as they have not already been spoiled by their contact with the white man, who is trying to bring the inhabitants of the whole world into servitude. And Nolde actually began to draft a book on tribal art. And in this book, he expressed that, a generation before him, all of the admiration went to classical Greek art and to the Renaissance painter Raphael as being the sort of pinnacle of artistic achievement. And then he says some things have changed since then. And he was talking about how Greek art and Raphael now leave people cold, and we become more interested in simple art that's sort of roughly made by anonymous artists. And maybe we see some of that interest in sort of craftsmanship and anti-classicism in Nolde's image here, which is his mask still life number 3. And once again, we see a continuation of the themes that we've seen since Cubism and Fauvism. The very bright colors, the flattening of the space, the broad application of the paint, the heavy impasto, and then with this interest in oceanic and African art as offering an alternative to the tradition of European classicism. Okay, so the second major early German Expressionist movement was really just a loose association of quite a few artists, although really 2 come to the fore. And this group is called Der Blaue Reiter. In fact, that wasn't even really the name of the group itself. It was instead the name of a journal, a magazine, that was formed by a man named Vasily Kandinsky, who was actually a Russian artist who at 30 years old sort of left his job as a lawyer in Moscow and moved to Munich, where he came into contact with a younger colleague whose name was Franz Marc, and that they met for the first time on New Year's Eve between 1910 and 1911. And they began to work with each other. First, they had an exhibition which showed from 1911 to 1912. And in 1912, they published their journal, which was called Der Blaue Reiter. The name of the journal, by the way, was sort of a completely whimsically selected name. The idea of a figure on horseback was something that appeared in Kandinsky's art over and over again during the period where he was painting in Munich. And it was seen by Kandinsky as this symbol for the potential salvation that was offered by art. And both Kandinsky and Marc agreed upon their interest in the color blue, which was seen as having a sort of spiritual quality. So in 1912, they began to publish this journal. They had all different kinds of artists contribute works. It was for writers, composers, poets. They had graphic artists. They even tried to get other visual artists involved in it, including the artist Matisse, who didn't want to contribute to it but allowed his works to be reproduced. Now, Der Blaue Reiter distinguished themselves from the other group we've already looked at, Der Brücke. Kandinsky saw their sort of impulsive, explosive self-expression as being insufficiently intellectual. But Marc and Kandinsky and the other members of Der Blaue Reiter thought that what was coming was a sort of new spiritual age that was going to overtake the modern, decadent, cynical, apathetic, material age. But they thought that what was required was some sort of great destructive upheaval an apocalypse that was going to sort of cleanse the way to lead to this new spiritual age. Like Die Brücke, they tried to separate themselves from the tradition of sort of fine art, the European tradition that had come before them. So it's an interesting movement, and we're going to find that these are two artists who are way more interested in the mystical and in the subjective, imaginative thoughts of the individual. Now, the first artist we're going to look at, we're only going to look at two works by Vasily Kandinsky, but he is a really, really important artist for the entire history of art. He was, as we said, a Russian-born artist. He wasn't just a painter. He was a painter, a dramatist, a poet. He was a teacher. He actually worked as an academic legal economist in Moscow before he came to Munich and devoted himself to art and became not only an artist but also an art theorist. And why he is so important is Vasily Kandinsky is the first artist who really, really takes us almost to the point of complete abstraction. In other words, to the point where art could be freed from the literal subject matter. He said that he did this as a result of having seen for two different things, and they're interesting. One of them is having seen a work of his art hung upside down. The other one was having seen Monet's haystacks. Now, we didn't look at Monet's haystacks, but Monet's haystacks were a group of paintings he did in the 1890s in a serial way, much like he did the facade of Rouen Cathedral. And so these things supposedly lead Kandinsky towards pure abstraction. Now, it's important to put this in the context of its time. This was in the early 20th century. This is an age of scientific advancement. This is the time of the splitting of the atom. There are experiments where people start to understand atomic structure. In other words, that was a thought that led people to believe that material objects had no real substance. So in other words, it shook our faith in tangible things. And so in a way, science, which is something that Der Blaue Reiter was interested in, is going to lead us towards abstract art. Now, this particular work, which is called Improvisation 28, and it's the second version, is one of Kandinsky's largest and most elaborate in his series of paintings that are named after musical titles. Improvisation and compositions that he does in the early second decade of the 20th century. Music was important to Kandinsky, and we've seen this before. So take your mind back to Whistler during Impressionism. But Kandinsky wrote about the role of music in his art. And by the way, he talked about in his art expressing soul vibrations. He said this, he said, color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with many strings, the artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another purposefully to cause vibrations of the soul. So this idea of music, once again, like we saw with Whistler, that picture is really about color and form and space and line being arranged in this way. And the big difference, I think, with Kandinsky is Kandinsky was also looking then as art as a sort of spiritual language. And so that is going to be, I think, the shift as we look into Kandinsky as compared to looking at an artist like Whistler. Now, this was the largest of these improvisations and compositions he worked on. Notice that the term improvisation, that is, again, a musical title. It suggests a certain swiftness in his motion, but he made quite a few preparatory drawings for this, even though the final picture was made pretty quickly. Now, I've mentioned Kandinsky's interest in sort of freeing painting from what we sometimes call the tyranny of the subject. In other words, this is the last great liberation of painting, that it no longer has to tell a story. Kandinsky's there, but he's not quite there. We'd mentioned when we talked about the title of Der Blaue Reiter that Kandinsky had been painting figures on horsebacks, the rider, repeatedly while he was working in Munich. That is really a subject that comes out of apocalyptic literature, like the horsemen of the apocalypse. And this real, and we mentioned that Der Blaue Reiter thought that like an apocalyptic cleansing was needed of mankind. So this picture really is not an abstract picture. It looks like it. It looks like just colors and lines and improvisation, almost this jazzy kind of quick staccato application of paint. The truth of it is we still can see forms. If you look at this curving line that segments the picture from the top right to the lower left, it sort of divides the picture on a diagonal. You can see the subjects. If you look on the left-hand side of the diagonal up here, you can see a boat and there are waves. That said that we could see a mountain over here, cannon. Some have seen a serpent, maybe this form over here. While on the right-hand side, there is relative calm. So you could see sort of chaos on the upper left. The right is sort of calm, and we see fields and landscape and buildings, maybe an embracing couple, some sort of form. So this is probably something that's meant to show the subject of the apocalypse, the end of the world, which is something that was a literary source that Kandinsky and Mark were interested in. So this is a cataclysm. So we are approaching abstraction, but we're not quite there yet. Now his forms increasingly get abstract. And if we look at a picture from the next year called Schwarze Linien, or black lines, we can see that we've ridded ourselves of even more of the subject, though we still know that this subject is wedded in landscape, and we can see mountain forms and treetops. But by 1912, Kandinsky had published his treatise, which he'd been working on since the early years of the 20th century. But he finally finishes it in 1910 before he publishes it 2 years later. And it was called Concerning the Spiritual in Art, which is very much something that we know that Franz Marc and Kandinsky are interested in. And this text tried to explain color and the meaning of color. It talked about, the awareness that painting non-figurative art could lead to something that was decoration and sort of not meaningful. I mean, what's interesting is the subject of the human nude, which was so important to an artist like Kirchner, was something that Der Blaue Reiter avoided as not being an important subject. So these were artists that headed in a different direction. In his treatise concerning the spiritual in art, Kandinsky talked about the importance of color and the importance of color as expressive of one's soul. He said, the harmony of color and form must be based solely upon the principle of proper contact with the human soul. So color working together with things like form and line and space were supposed to express one's feelings. Just to give you a sense of what he wrote about color, Kandinsky was really kind of explicit, and he broke down a meaning for every different kind of color in his work, and again, always relating it back to music. Here you could see him describing the different colors, and this again is all from his treatise. And here he says, blue is the heavenly color. It retreats from the spectator, moving towards its own center. It beckons to the infinite, arousing a longing for purity and the supersensuous. Light blue is the sound of the flute. Dark blue has the sound of a cello. So you see he's relating, as we saw before, music and color, so that you could almost then, in a way, sort of play his composition. Um, when Kandinsky wrote about his pictures, he talked about the sound of color over the sound of form. So then he goes on. He says, yellow is the color of the earth. It has no profound meaning. It seems to spread out from its own center and to advance to the spectator from the canvas. It has the shrill sound of a canary or a brass horn and is often associated with the sour taste of lemons. And he goes on to talk about the meanings of green and white and black. I'm just showing you a sampling of it here. But again, with Kandinsky, what is important is we first get this idea that something apocalyptic had to happen to make painting sort of come to this pure state of representing the soul, and that we were going to get closer and closer to abstraction than we'd ever been before. The younger of the two artists that we associate with Der Blaue Reiter was Franz Marc, and he's an artist who has a real interest in nature as well as in animals. And in fact, between 1907 and 1910, he earned a living, at least in part, as an anatomy teacher. But like Kandinsky, he was very, very interested in color and in the way that color could express meaning and things like spirituality. He talked about the importance of color, and especially towards moving towards a sort of symbolism of color, which would create the sense of abstraction in art. And what he said was this: art is metaphysical. It will free itself from man's purposes and desires. We will no longer paint the forest or the horse as they please us or appear to us, but as they really are, as the forest or the horse feel themselves, their absolute being, which lives behind the appearance which we see. We will be successful insofar as we can succeed in overcoming the traditional logic of millennia with artistic creativity. There are art forms which are abstract, which can never be proven by human knowledge. These forms have always existed, but were always obscured by human knowledge and desire. The faith in art itself was lacking, but we shall build it. It lives on the other side. As you could see, he was a student of philosophy. He was also a student of theology, and Marc was something of an intellectual. In terms of artistic influence, he said that Van Gogh was the most authentic of painters, and probably because of the emotional quality that was given to his works. Now, this is still a pretty early work for him, which is called The Large Blue Horses. And of course, horses were a theme that were common to both Kandinsky and Franz Marc, which led to the name the Blue Reiter. And here we do see that they're blue horses as well. So you can see his interest already growing in color. These horses look sort of almost sculptural. You can see it's a close-up view of the horses who are completely filling the canvas. You could see the way the curving forms of the horses' bodies, very sort of abstract, is mirrored in the rolling hills in the landscape. And you could see that the entire space that the horses occupy is sort of framed in by these two white trees, which branch off on the left and right, but sort of compress the picture plane. So we have that ongoing idea of the tension between a three-dimensional picture with these foreshortened bodies of the horses and the two-dimensional surface that's all about color and pattern. And Kandinsky, of course, talked about the importance of color. And at one point he wrote in a letter, blue is the male principle, severe and spiritual. Yellow is the female principle, gentle, happy, and sensual. Red is matter, brutal and heavy. So the idea is that there was almost a language, a system that was developed where colors could express very specific meanings. Now, Franz Marc's most interesting, beautiful, devastating picture is a picture that we call The Fate of the Animals, which actually had different titles in Marc's own time. The picture is inscribed on the back with a Buddhist phrase that is, and all being is flaming suffering. But ultimately, Mark's friend, a painter named Paul Klee, who we're going to look at, suggested the new title, and now we call it The Fate of the Animals, or sometimes Animal Destinies. The picture itself is showing an apocalyptic event of some sort. This is a cataclysm. Animals are trapped in a forest and are being destroyed. We can pick out the animals, and Mark, as we said, he was very interested in the animal as subject. He saw the animals as being more, he said, more beautiful and more pure than humanity, and so a better way to represent truth. But we can see here this sort of flaming tree. There are green horses up at the top, sort of turning their heads and sort of reacting in anguish. We can see pink boars down at the bottom. And then the central tragic figure of this blue deer, which is sort of hitting its head up in the air against this tipping tree, forming this harsh diagonal. And the entire surface looks like it's made out of these shards of glass, like intersecting rays of light. So it is a horrific image of something terrible and, as we said, cataclysmic. What is sort of especially tragic about this picture is what happens with Mark. So Mark had painted this picture. It was shown at the most important avant-garde exhibition when he painted it in 1913, which was the German Autumn Salon. But then Mark went off to fight in the war. And when he was on the front in 1915, his friend sent him a postcard with this image printed on it, with his own picture on it. And Mark wrote to his wife, and he said, "Kohler wrote me today on a Sturm postcard of my fate of the animals. At first glance, I was completely shaken. It is like a premonition of this war, terrifying and gripping. I can hardly believe that I painted it. In the hazy photograph, in any case, its effect is so unbelievably truthful that it's uncanny." By the way, this picture has suffered. So the idea that all being is flaming suffering. If you look at the right-hand side of the picture where you see that it's very dark, the picture actually was badly damaged. It was at an exhibition at the Sturm Gallery, and a fire broke out, and it was partially destroyed. So that's where fire had actually struck the picture on the right-hand side, and Mark's friend Paul Klee did a restoration on the work in that brownish tone, which almost makes it look like there's a veil thrown over the picture. But of course, the real tragedy is Franz Marc himself. So he paints this picture of this apocalyptic world, all filled with the same symbolic color that he and Kandinsky were interested in. And then he got this postcard sent to him while he was on the front fighting. But in fact, Mark was killed in war in 1916. And so this becomes like this last sad premonition of what had happened, right? Not only that, but also the destruction of the work that followed. And just on a final note, and to relate it to the other German expressionists that we've looked at, this picture was also declared degenerate by the Nazis in 1937 and was confiscated. Really, though, one of the most original of the German expressionists was the painter Käthe Kollwitz. She was working as an artist from the 1890s all the way up until a few weeks shy of the end of World War II, which is when she died. She was trained as a painter, and her father recognized her skill in drawing as a young age and encouraged that. But then she also worked as a printmaker and as a sculptor. Now, we primarily know her as a printmaker. She has about 275 prints that survive, and she worked in actually every kind of technique. She worked in woodcut, which is a relief technique. She worked in etching, which is an intaglio technique, and she worked in the planimetric technique of lithography. Kollwitz was a very politically motivated artist. She married a man who was a medical practitioner, and she spent a lot of time witnessing poverty and suffering and hunger and the poor. And then she became especially motivated politically after World War I. Now, the quote I'm showing you at the bottom is something that Kollwitz wrote in 1944 in the midst of World War II, which was only the year before her death. And she wrote, "Every war already carries within it the war that will answer it. Every war is answered by a new war until everything is smashed. That's why I am so wholeheartedly for a radical end to this madness, and why my only hope is in world socialism." When I say that she's a political artist, we see it not only in her woodcuts, but she increasingly starts to make posters for political causes. And this is one of her most famous images, which is Never Again War from 1924. Posters were great and prints were great for political commentary because they were inexpensive, they were easy to reproduce. Now, Kollwitz, just as an idea, she was pretty successful as a female artist. And in fact, in 1919, she was the first German woman who was elected to the Prussian Academy. And by 1928, she was the only female professor there. She was forced to resign in 1933 during the Nazi regime. However, they never did declare her art degenerate. So even though she was very politically motivated against war, the Nazis actually used some of her images for propaganda. Now, I just wanted to show you very quickly her most famous series. So she does a number of these series of prints. This one was directly in response to the horrors of World War I. And World War I was something that was perceived differently by different artists in the art world. We're shortly going to talk about Italian futurism, and the futurists, they embraced the idea of World War I as sort of the world's only hygiene. And a lot of the futurists campaigned to join the war. And there was more enthusiasm for the war in 1914. It was seen as something sort of exciting and an adventure and patriotic. But World War I killed 1.6 million people in Germany and 4 million were wounded. And it was very personal for Kollwitz. So her and her husband were both pacifists, but her son, Peter, she had two boys, her son, Peter, wanted to enlist in the war. And he was only 18 years old, and there was a rule that if you were under 18, you had to get the permission of your parents, and they reluctantly gave it. And Peter died in Belgium in battle only 10 days after he enlisted. And that was something that shaped Kollwitz's imagery for the rest of her life. So this was a series of 4 woodcuts that she made between 1921 and 1922. So these are images that are carved onto a wooden block, and we talked about this. You carve away everything that's going to be the white, so then you can ink it and press it on paper, and it's very good for these bold, graphic. It's sort of the style sort of captures the trauma of the imagery. And Kollwitz worked on each image as many as 9 different times, making different versions, and she simplified them over and over radically till she got to these 7 images that are very, very stark. What's interesting about her image of the war is that it doesn't show battle. Instead, she focuses on the people that were left behind by the dead soldiers. So on women and children and widows. You could see then the whole series of the images from the sacrifice, which shows a mother handing over her newborn child as sort of like an offering towards war, through the men going off to war and the volunteers, the parents, which actually becomes a model for her son Peter's tomb, these 2 grieving parents forming almost this tombstone-like shape with their bodies, to 2 different images of widows, the mothers, where you see these women bound together in this solid mass to show not only grief, but also the need for solidarity among the people. And then finally, the people. The most famous of the plates is the volunteers. And it's interesting because it's the only one that shows anything of soldiers at all going into battle. And so here you can see a group of men sort of ecstatic with their eyes closed, following a drummer who is a skull. So this is the image of death, who's actually leading and marching them into war. I believe that it's this figure that you see right here, who is the image of her son Peter, who closely follows that image of death. And again, here you can see the very, very expressive quality, the way she's taking advantage of the rough texture of the wood to create these really bold, stark lines in this very graphic image. And you could see all of them. It's all about suffering, and they're all just being pulled towards their fate. In any case, Kollwitz remains one of our most interesting artists for focusing in a different way. We saw female artists like Mary Cassatt in the past focus on their personal life and their personal experience as mothers. And Kollwitz does the same thing, but with this starkly political bent. Even though this lecture has mostly been about the German Expressionists, we do need to include the Viennese painter Egon Schiele, who had a very short career. He died of the Spanish flu, actually only 3 days after his pregnant wife died from the flu as well, at the age of 28 in 1918. However, despite that, he has a very, very productive career. He left behind about 300 oil paintings and thousands of works on paper, which are really what he was most known for. He got an early start to his career. He entered the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts at the age of 16 in 1906. And at that point, that means he was the youngest artist who had ever enrolled in the academy. He stayed for 3 years and finished his course of studies, but he left rather disappointed in the experience because, like most academies, it was a conservative experience, and he was seen as something of a rebel. Then again, it gave him a very important opportunity because when he got to the academy, he sought out Gustav Klimt, who was 28 years older than he was. But Klimt became his mentor, and the two men became friends as well. His works very, very heavily focus on self-portraiture. There are many, many self-portraits. Starting from here, you could see one in 1906, the year he entered into the academy, and he makes many of these, which really means not only, unlike an artist like, let's say, Kandinsky, who sort of shuns the human body as a subject, the human body becomes the primary subject for Schiele. Now, a lot of his works are highly charged and sexual in their imagery. And he himself had a run-in with the law in that regard. In 1912, he had been seeking out children models, and he was imprisoned for a period of 24 days for quote-unquote offenses against public morality. He was originally charged with seducing an underage girl and exhibiting pornographic materials to them, which really were his artworks. So he spent a number of days, weeks in jail, and he wrote about it in his journal. And he said this: "At the hearing, one of my confiscated drawings, the one that had hung in my bedroom, was solemnly burned over a candle flame by the judge in his robes. Auto da fe, Savonarola, Inquisition, Middle Ages, castration, hypocrisy. Go then to the museums and cut up the greatest works of art into little pieces. He who denies sex is a filthy person who smears in the lowest way his own parents who have begotten him." That said, his images are very sexually charged. He portrays himself very often in the nude. He makes images of himself masturbating. This one is particularly one that stands out from that group, mostly because here we see the subject of the male nude, which is the traditional academic subject of art. And yet we see him with this black cloak over his shoulders, which highlights the fact that he's not a nude, but in fact calling attention to the fact that he's naked. He rejects in his art any sort of traditional notion of aesthetic beauty, and instead the works are about raw sexuality and narcissism and anxiety. And as we saw in the case of the legal matter, they sometimes border on pornography. It said that he had some difficult issues with sexuality. His father had syphilis and he died insane, and that caused his mother to give birth to several stillborn children. So he seemed to have had this ideas about sexuality and mortality, and it affects clearly his relationship he sees with his own body. When he makes these images, you can see that they are sort of brutal. They're hard to look at. He uses moments of arbitrary color. The body seems very raw. You can see all the brushstrokes. He is, though, looking back on tradition, and like we've seen a lot of the expressionists do, they looked back especially on a German tradition. And so what really comes to mind is the German painter and printmaker Albrecht Dürer, who began making self-portrait images like Sheila as a teen and made them throughout his life, and again, often unflinching images of his own body. Not long after Sheila was released from prison, he painted this picture, which is originally titled Caress by him, or Embrace, but now we know it simply as The Cardinal and Nun. And it's actually based on a sort of self-portrait image along with his lover, not his wife, but his lover, who was a woman named Wally. And of course, you probably can see the reference. Sheila was, as we said, very influenced by Klimt, and this really becomes something of a comment on it and a parody of it. And obviously, he borrows the form of the two figures, the man and woman, locked in this embrace. And that's about where the comparisons end. You could see they're almost set off of each other. Obviously, the male and female bodies are united together, but also separate from each other. And Klimt accomplishes that with the different geometric patterns on the body, the rectilinear versus the curving forms, while Sheila does that with these stark, flat areas of geometric color with the cardinal's outfit, which is the red, and the nun's outfit, which is black. Rather than the woman who seems sort of pliant in the arms of the man in Klimt's picture, here the nun looks stiff and petrified, which gives us this sense of ambivalent about this moment. While Klimt's is set against that starry, sort of golden ground, speckled, that relates to mosaics, but it looks timeless, like it's in the cosmos. Sheila sets his in this darkness of the abyss. And Sheila, of course, plays with the notion of the pose, because the pose is of the two figures kneeling. And so you could see the way that Klimt took what was a very sexual image and a sexual act and made it seem sort of divine or sacred. Sheila is taking the act of prayer and makes it look sexual. So you could see a very different attitude and a different tension. But we can see that style that we associate with Sheila, the sort of flat, rough treatment of the surface, the sort of ambivalent questioning about sexuality, but also an image that is very big and confrontational. I even like the way that he chooses the same proportions. Like, you're very clearly supposed to see the reference to the other work. He even signs his work off the edge of whatever this cliff-like abyss is, on the bottom right-hand corner, in the same way that Sheila signs his, and that Klimt signs his. So I don't have time to do a lot with Sheila, but his imageries are raw, they're unflinching, they approach issues of psychology, they're all about the sort of interior state, and show Sheila to be somewhat of a troubled person during his very brief painting career.